The alien princess pointed to the quietest human warrior and said, "He will be mine." She was good at filling those pauses. She arrived at the station with a small team, 3 diplomatic aides, 2 translators, 1 communications officer, and a security escort of 4 soldiers from the United Earth Defense Corps. The soldiers were there to protect the delegation, stand at doors, and look dependable. They were not supposed to be interesting. Most of the time, they weren't. The exception was Corporal Ethan Cole. He was 26 years old, not particularly tall, with dark brown eyes and dark hair kept short in the regulation style. He had grown up on a cattle ranch in the wide open spaces of rural Montana, where the nearest neighbor had been 15 miles away and silence had been the normal state of things. He had joined the Defense Corps at 19, after his older brother was killed in a contact incident with a hostile alien force near the outer colonies. He had not joined out of anger exactly. He had joined because it seemed like the right thing to do, and because standing still while the world changed around him had never felt like an option. Ethan did not talk much. The other soldiers in the escort, Corporal Danny Ruiz, who was loud and cheerful and spent most of his free time making other people laugh, and Specialists Nora Grant and Kevin Tate, who had their own easy friendship built on years of service together, had long since accepted that Ethan was simply a quiet person. He was not cold. He was not unfriendly. He just did not speak unless he had something worth saying. What Ethan did, instead of talking, was watch. While Danny made jokes with the station's maintenance crew, and Nora and Kevin compared notes on the alien food options in the main hall, Ethan moved through the conclave the way water moves through a landscape, finding the natural paths, going around obstacles, settling into the low places. He memorized the station's layout in the first 2 hours. He noted where the ventilation systems were, which corridors had the best sight lines, and which alien guards seemed genuinely alert versus which ones were simply standing in a spot because they had been told to. He watched the delegations arrive and made quiet mental notes about each one. He was standing near the back wall of the great reception hall when the Vel Shara delegation entered. The room changed when they walked in. It was not a dramatic change. No one gasped, no music played, but the quality of attention in the room shifted the way a crowd shifts when something important enters. The Vel Shara were tall, easily a head taller than the average human, with golden-toned skin that caught the hall's light in a way that made them look like they had been carved rather than born. Their eyes were amber, a deep, warm amber that looked almost metallic depending on the angle. They moved with a kind of unhurried certainty, as though they had decided long ago that rushing was beneath them. There were 9 of them, 8 advisors and guards arranged around a central figure who walked with the particular composure of someone who had been told since childhood that the world was watching her. She wore formal robes in deep red and gold, and she wore them the way people wear armor, not for display, but for purpose. Princess Sarava Narvel was the 3rd daughter of the Velshara High Throne. She was not the heir. She had not been sent to this summit because she was the most powerful person in her family's government. She had asked to come, which was unusual, and she had been allowed to, which was even more unusual. The reason she had given the throne was that she wanted to observe humanity directly. The reports she had read about humans were contradictory and confusing. Some described them as reckless and primitive. Others described something that sounded almost like admiration, buried underneath careful diplomatic language. She wanted to form her own opinion. She moved through the reception hall slowly, her amber eyes drifting across the gathered humans, with an expression that was not unkind, but was absolutely evaluating. She looked at Ambassador Caroline and held that gaze for a moment before moving on. She looked at the aides and found them unremarkable. She looked at the soldiers near the door and found them professionally arranged. Then her eyes reached the back wall. Ethan was not doing anything noticeable. He was standing in his position, arms relaxed at his sides, watching the room the way he always watched rooms, steadily, without urgency, taking everything in. He had noticed Sarava the moment she walked through the door. He had registered her as the highest-ranking member of the delegation, noted the placement of her guards, and returned his attention to the wider room. He was not staring at her. He was not avoiding looking at her. He had simply seen her, understood what he needed to understand, and moved on. That was what stopped her eyes. Every other human in the room had reacted to her arrival in some visible way, slight stiffening, a quick glance, a barely hidden curiosity. This one had looked at her with the same calm attention he gave everything else. Not dismissal, not indifference, something more like the gaze of a person who was genuinely paying attention to the whole room, and had no need to perform any particular reaction to any part of it. Sarava's eyes stayed on him for 3 seconds longer than they had stayed on anyone else. Then she looked away, composed as ever, and followed her advisors to the Velshara seats. Her head advisor, an older man named Kale, leaned close and asked quietly if everything was satisfactory. Sarava said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Continue the schedule." Kale nodded, but he had served her long enough to notice that she did not answer the question he had actually asked. Across the hall, Ethan had already moved his attention back to the main doors, where the next delegation was beginning to arrive. The alien princess pointed to the quietest human warrior and said, "He will be mine." Part 2. The test no one announced. The second day of the conclave began early, with the smell of something that the station's kitchen systems had decided counted as coffee, and a light that came through the corridor windows in long, pale strips. The formal sessions were not scheduled to begin until mid-morning, which meant the hallways were full of delegations moving between private meetings, advisors having quiet arguments, and various alien species discovering that the buffet tables in the common hall had been arranged without any understanding of what most of them actually ate. Ethan was already at his post by the time Ambassador Caroline arrived in the main diplomatic wing. He had eaten at dawn, reviewed the day's schedule, and walked the perimeter of the human delegation's assigned area twice. Danny Ruiz had shown up 10 minutes later with a plate of something that smelled strongly of cinnamon, and a cheerful complaint about the size of his sleeping quarters. Nora and Kevin had arrived together, already in conversation about the Grethkai delegation, which had apparently been very loud the previous evening in the corridors near the crew quarters. The Grethkai were large. That was the first thing most people noticed. They averaged about 8 feet tall, with 6 limbs, 4 used for walking, 2 used for everything else, and bodies covered in thick overlapping plates that ranged in color from dark gray to deep brown, depending on the individual. They communicated through a combination of spoken sounds and physical posture, and the result was that even a calm Grethkai conversation looked and sounded fairly alarming to species that were not familiar with them. They were also deeply formal in ways that were easy to misread. In Grethkai culture, the way you stood, the direction you faced, and the distance you maintained from another person said as much as anything you said with words. Getting those things wrong was not just rude, it was, depending on context, a direct challenge. The incident started just before the morning session. One of Ambassador Caroline's junior aides, a young man named Pete Lawson, who was 23 years old and on his first diplomatic assignment and doing his honest best, walked through a corridor on his way to the main hall and passed directly through the middle of what turned out to be a Grethkai formal greeting circle. A specific arrangement of 3 Grethkai standing at precise distances from a central point, performing a morning acknowledgement ritual. Pete had not known the ritual existed. He had seen 3 large beings standing in the hallway, and had said, "Excuse me," in what he felt was a polite tone, and kept walking. To the Grethkai, a being walking through the center of a greeting circle was one of the most direct insults possible. It announced, in their body language, that the intruder considered the participants to be of no social worth. Within seconds, all 3 Grethkai had turned to face Pete, with their full bodies squared. another signal that in their culture meant a formal dispute was being opened. Pete, to his credit, stopped walking. He also went very still, because even without knowing the cultural context, having 3 8-foot armored beings turn to face you in a narrow corridor communicated something fairly clear. 2 other soldiers from the escort were closer to the situation than Ethan. Both reached for their weapons at the same time. One of them, Kevin Tate, had already taken 2 steps forward with his hand on his sidearm before Ethan passed him. Ethan moved quietly. He did not run. He did not shout. He simply went from his position to the center of the corridor in a smooth, unhurried way that somehow communicated absolute intent, without any of the signals that would have made things worse. He placed himself between Pete and the lead Grethkai, a large individual with dark brown plates and a classification marking on his upper limb that Ethan had memorized from the species briefing document 4 days ago, when the delegation rosters had first been sent to the security team. He kept his hands open and visible at his sides. His voice was low enough that people further down the corridor had to go quiet to hear anything at all. He addressed the lead Grethkai by his full honorific title, Vel Krath, Honored First Circle Gurin, which was the formal address for a Grethkai of senior standing in a ritual context. He had found it in the briefing document in a footnote that had clearly been added by someone who did not expect anyone to actually read it. He spoke the title carefully, with the correct pauses, and he dipped his chin in the small specific way the document had described, as a gesture of acknowledged presence. The lead Grethkai's posture shifted, not much, just enough. Ethan then said, in simple and even words, that the young human had passed through the circle without awareness and not without respect. He said that humanity was young and still learning the proper forms of courtesy, and that the ignorance had not come from the position of someone who considered the Grethkai to be without worth, but from the position of someone who had not yet been given the gift of understanding their customs. He asked formally if the circle could be considered intact, and if the error could be received as the honest mistake of a species still finding its way. He did not apologize on Pete's behalf in the way that would have implied weakness. He framed it the way the briefing document said Grethkai understood these things, as a gap in education, not a failure of respect. There was a difference in their culture, and it mattered. The lead Grethkai was silent for what felt like a long time. Then he made a sound low in his chest and turned his body 45 degrees to the side, which the document had described as the posture of accepted resolution, and the other 2 Grethkai followed. The circle was closed. The incident was over. It had taken less than 3 minutes. Pete Lawson let out a breath that he had clearly been holding for the entire exchange. Kevin Tate quietly put his weapon back. Danny Ruiz, who had arrived somewhere in the middle of it all, looked at Ethan with an expression that mixed admiration with the kind of exhaustion that comes from realizing someone near you is quietly excellent. No report was filed. No formal incident was logged. The corridor went back to its normal morning business as though nothing had happened. Ambassador Caroline, who had been 20 feet away and had watched the entire thing with her hands folded and her face carefully arranged into diplomatic neutrality, waited until Ethan had returned to his position before walking over to him. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You read the footnotes." Ethan said he read everything. She nodded once, in the way of someone who has just updated a file in their head, and went to find Pete Lawson to have a different kind of conversation with him. In the upper observation gallery above the main floor, Princess Sarava had been watching. She had arrived early to observe the human delegation before the formal session began. She had told Kale it was a strategic review. Kale had said nothing because he was experienced enough to let certain things go unquestioned. She had seen the incident develop. She had seen the 2 human soldiers reach for weapons. She had seen Ethan move past them, slow and sure, and she had watched the whole thing resolve itself in that low, quiet voice she could not quite hear from where she was standing. She did not lean forward in her chair. She was Velshara royalty, and she had more composure than that. But she turned to Kale and said, "I want his personnel file." Kale blinked. "The human soldier?" "The quiet one," she said. And Kale, who had served her long enough to understand when a conversation was already decided, simply went to find the file. The alien princess pointed to the quietest human warrior and said, "He will be mine." Part 3. She will be mine. The third morning arrived, the way important mornings often do, quietly, with no indication of what it was about to become. The hallways of the conclave were a little less chaotic than they had been on the first 2 days. Delegations had found their rhythms. The kitchen had figured out that several species needed their food heated to temperatures that would have been genuinely dangerous to others, and had rearranged the buffet accordingly. The translation systems had been recalibrated after a misunderstanding on day 1 involving the word alliance, which apparently meant something very different in Velshara than it did in the common trade language. Things were, in the fragile way of diplomacy, settling. Ethan noticed the change in Sarava before most people noticed she had moved. She came down from the upper gallery earlier than her schedule indicated. She walked with her usual composure, the steady, unhurried pace that the Velshara seemed to practice from birth. But there was a direction in it that had not been there before. She was not wandering. She was going somewhere specific. She requested, through her head advisor Kale, a private audience with Ambassador Caroline Hale. The request was formal and followed every correct diplomatic protocol. Caroline, who had been in a briefing with her aides when the message arrived, read it twice, said something quietly under her breath that the aides decided not to hear, and agreed to the meeting within the hour. They met in one of the station's small side chambers, a room with a round table, 6 chairs, and a window that looked out onto the dark stretch of space between the station and the nearer of the 2 suns. Sarava came with Kale and 1 other advisor. Caroline came with her senior aide, and at the door, the standard security escort. Ethan was at the door. Sarava opened with diplomatic acknowledgments. She was precise and correct in all the expected ways, and Caroline matched her exactly. And for about 4 minutes it looked like a completely normal bilateral meeting between 2 representatives of very different civilizations. Then Sarava set both her hands flat on the table, in a gesture that Kale clearly recognized, because his expression shifted from professional calm to something closer to careful attention. She said that she had observed the human delegation since their arrival. She said that she had observed the incident in the corridor the previous morning. She said that she had read the personnel file of the soldier designated Corporal Ethan Cole. Then she stood. The Velshara binding custom, Kale had explained to the human delegation's translator in a rapid and very quiet exchange roughly 40 seconds earlier, was one of the oldest formal traditions in Velshara culture. A royal of standing could declare a bond companion, an equal partner chosen by the royal's own judgment. The declaration, once spoken aloud before witnesses, could not be withdrawn. It was considered one of the highest honors a Velshara could bestow. It was also, by custom, always accepted, because no one had ever been in a position to do otherwise. Sarava turned and looked at the door. She looked at Ethan. She said in a clear and steady voice, with every person in the room listening, "He will be mine." The room went silent. Not the polite quiet of a pause in conversation. The absolute silence of a space where everyone has stopped breathing at the same time. Pete Lawson, who happened to be passing the open door with a stack of documents, stopped walking in the hallway. Danny Ruiz, 2 positions down from Ethan, turned his head very slowly in the manner of someone hoping that if they moved carefully enough, no one would notice they had just heard something extraordinary. Caroline's senior aide, a very experienced woman named Laura Beck, who had been in diplomacy for 22 years, looked down at her notepad and began writing something that she would later admit was just the word "remarkable," repeated in different sizes. Caroline herself went through a very compressed series of internal experiences and emerged from the other side with her face arranged in the expression she used when a negotiation had just changed shape entirely, and she needed time to understand the new shape before reacting to it. Sarava stood composed and certain, amber eyes on Ethan at the door. Ethan met her gaze. His face did not do the thing that faces usually do when someone receives unexpected news. No wide eyes, no color change, no visible recalibration. He looked at her the way he looked at everything, with that steady, thinking attention that had apparently been the thing that caught her interest in the first place. Then he said, in a calm and even voice, "Am I being consulted or informed?" The Velshara advisors went rigid. Kale, specifically, went through a change in posture that suggested his body had received instructions from his brain that it was not fully prepared to follow. He opened his mouth, he closed it. He looked at Sarava. Sarava was looking at Ethan. Her expression had not broken, the composure was still there, full and intact. But something behind her amber eyes had shifted in a way that was new. Not offense, not confusion exactly. Something closer to the expression of a person who has been handed a question they did not know they needed to be asked. She said, slowly, that Velshara declarations had always been accepted. Ethan said that he did not doubt that. He said that where he came from, both people usually had a say in the matter. Kale made a very quiet sound. Caroline set her pen down. The morning session was delayed by 45 minutes, while the various advisors in the room quietly worked out how to describe what had just happened in their official records, without any of it causing a diplomatic incident. The Velshara tradition did not have a framework for a declaration being questioned. Not denied, not refused, simply questioned. Their cultural and legal advisors spent a good portion of the delay going through historical records trying to find a precedent, and finding none. Meanwhile, Sarava asked Caroline for a few minutes, which Caroline gave her, because Caroline was a very good diplomat and understood that sometimes the correct move was to step back and let the other person have the room. Sarava walked to the door. She looked at Ethan, who had not moved from his post. She told him that she did not intend the declaration as an order. She told him with a careful precision that suggested she was choosing each word with more deliberateness than usual, that in her culture it was understood as an honor and a statement of worth, that she saw in him something that her people valued deeply, and that she had said so openly, before witnesses, because her custom required directness. Ethan listened to all of it. Then he said, "Then I heard it. I'm not saying no, I'm saying I'd like to talk first." Sarava was quiet for a moment. The corridor hummed with the quiet mechanical life of the station. Then she said, "I will allow that." And for just a moment, brief enough that anyone not paying close attention would have missed it entirely, the corner of her mouth moved upward. Kale, who was paying close attention, noted it, said nothing, and began quietly preparing for the possibility that the next several years were going to be considerably more complicated than originally planned. Across the station, word spread with the particular speed of news that is too interesting to stay contained. By the time the afternoon session began, every major delegation on the station had heard some version of what had happened. The core fact remained. The Velshara princess had made a declaration, and the human soldier at the door had asked for a conversation instead. Most species found this bewildering. 2 species found it funny. One very old civilization, whose representatives had been traveling between stars since before humanity had invented writing, sent a quiet message to their home world that said only, "The humans are more interesting than the reports suggested." And in a side corridor near the diplomatic wing, Ethan Cole stood at his post and waited for the afternoon to begin, looking, as always, like a man who had simply said the thing that seemed right, and was now ready to deal with whatever came next. He had meant what he told her. He was not saying no. He was just not the kind of person who let important things happen to him without understanding them first. The alien princess pointed to the quietest human warrior and said, "He will be mine." Part 4. The weight of quiet. 3 days passed after the declaration. The accords continued. Delegations argued, compromised, argued again, and sometimes reached agreements that would hold for a generation. The station kept its course around the binary stars. The kitchen finally found a preparation method for the Grethkai's preferred foods that did not set off the fire suppression systems. And Sarava found reasons to be near Ethan. It began professionally, which gave everyone involved a useful excuse to not ask too many questions. She formally requested, through the correct diplomatic channels, that Corporal Ethan Cole be assigned as a secondary security presence during certain joint sessions involving her delegation. Her stated reason was the Grethkai incident. She noted, with complete accuracy, that he had demonstrated both cultural awareness and de-escalation capability at a level that was valuable to the safety of the proceedings. Caroline read the request, signed it, and said nothing to anyone. She had been a diplomat for 30 years, and she understood that sometimes the job required letting things develop. Ethan received the reassignment without visible reaction and went to his new post. The first time they were in the same room together under the new arrangement, they did not speak for the first hour. That was fine for both of them. Ethan watched the session the way he always watched rooms, and Sarava participated in the discussion with her usual precision, and the silence between them was simply the silence of two people who did not need to fill air with words. Then there was a recess. The advisors and diplomats moved toward the small refreshment tables along the wall. Sarava stood at the edge of the room near a window. Ethan stood 6 feet away at his post. She looked at the stars outside. The binary system turned slowly. One star orange, one a pale yellow-white. The space between them an impossible dark blue. She said without looking at him, "Your home planet has one sun." Ethan said yes. She said, "Is it strange to see two?" He thought about it for a second. Then he said it had been, the first time. Now it just looked like the sky outside, whatever the sky happened to be. She turned her head slightly toward him. "You adapt quickly." He said people from Montana usually do. She did not know what Montana was. So he told her, the open land, the cold winters, the distances between people, the particular quality of silence that exists when you are standing in a field at night and the nearest other person is miles away. He did not talk about it the way people talk about home when they are being nostalgic. He talked about it the way you describe a place you carry with you, matter-of-factly and without performance. She listened. This became the pattern. Recesses, corridor walks between sessions, the occasional evening near the observation windows that faced the binary stars. Their conversations were not long. They did not need to be. Ethan said precise things in small numbers of words, and Sarava, who had spent her whole life surrounded by people who spoke at length to say nothing, found this unexpectedly restful. She learned more about him in pieces. He had an older brother who had died in service, a detail he mentioned once, quietly, and she did not press it. He had been reading a physical book, actual paper pages, which was so unusual that she asked to see it, and he handed it over without hesitation, and she turned it in her hands like a person holding an artifact. He had chosen the Defense Corps not out of any great ambition, but simply because it had seemed like the right thing to do. And he had not yet found a reason to change his mind. He learned things about her, too. She had 3 elder brothers, all celebrated in the Velshara military tradition, all louder and more visible in every way than she was. She had grown up being observed, by courtiers, by historians, by her own family, but almost never simply spoken to. Every conversation she could remember before the age of 16 had been either instruction or evaluation. Someone teaching her the correct way to do something, or someone measuring whether she had learned it. She told him this on the 4th evening, standing at the observation window after a particularly long session had finally ended. She told it to him the way she told him most things, directly and without decoration, but there was a weight in it that her direct tone could not fully conceal. He said, "That sounds like a long time to wait before anyone had an actual conversation with you." She turned to look at him. He was already looking back, and there was nothing in his expression except the same simple attention he gave everything. And somehow, that was the most straightforwardly kind thing she had been offered in years. She said, yes, it was. The following afternoon, things on the station changed. A member of the station's security team, a young officer from a small neutral species called the Vathi, came to Ethan during an afternoon break with a question about a report she had filed. She had noticed something odd in the station's movement logs. A service corridor in the lower section of the station had been accessed 7 times in 3 days by the same maintenance code. But the maintenance team had no record of sending anyone there. She had flagged it, and her superior had told her it was probably a logging error. She had not been satisfied with that answer, and she had not been sure who else to bring it to. Ethan read the movement log she had printed out. Then he asked her 4 questions. When the accesses happened relative to the formal sessions, which delegation's quarters were closest to that corridor, whether the station's life support subsystem for that section was part of a shared network or isolated, and whether the maintenance code used was assigned to a specific individual or a general team pool. She answered all 4. By the time she finished the last answer, Ethan was already standing up. He went to find the station's head of security, a broad and experienced being named Veth, who had run the Conclave safety systems for 11 years. He brought the Vathi officer with him. He laid out everything calmly and in order, not as a theory, but as a pattern of facts with a gap in the middle that needed to be explained. He said that if the gap turned out to be a logging error, nothing was lost. He said that if it was not a logging error, they were already behind on time. Veth pulled 2 of his teams and sent them to the lower corridor. They found 3 members of the Grethkai delegation's extended staff, not the lead diplomats, but support personnel, in the process of introducing a targeted chemical agent into the life support intake for the shared ventilation system used by 6 of the main meeting halls. The agent would not have killed anyone outright. It would have made every delegate in the affected halls too ill to continue proceedings. And, by Grethkai internal law, if the Accord session was interrupted before a formal signing, the entire agreement would need to restart from the beginning. The sabotage was stopped. The signing was preserved. The 3 staff members were detained. The full security team, Veth confirmed to Caroline later that evening, had been monitoring the station for 11 days and had not identified the threat. Ethan had found the pattern in 40 minutes from a second-hand report filed by a junior officer that had been dismissed as a logging error. Caroline informed Ethan of this and waited to see what he would do with it. I just had time to read it. That evening, after the news had moved through the station in the particular electric way that near disasters travel when they have been stopped in time, Sarava found Ethan at the observation window. She stood beside him. Outside, the binary stars turned in their slow, patient orbit around each other, orange light and pale light crossing and blending in the dark. She said, "You found it before anyone else did." He said, "I noticed the pattern early. That's different from being better." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The declaration still stands." He looked at her. She was looking out at the stars, her expression composed and steady in the way that he had come to understand meant she was saying something that cost her something, even if her voice did not show it. She said, "But I want you to know that it stands because of this. All of this. The way you watch, the way you think, the way you speak as though the words matter before you say them." She paused. "Where I come from, those things are valued. I am not certain you know how much." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think I'm starting to understand." The stars kept turning outside the window, and neither of them moved to leave, and the silence between them was not empty at all. The alien princess pointed to the quietest human warrior, and said, "He will be mine." Part 5. What He Chooses. The last day of the conclave of Veroth arrived on a morning that looked like every other morning on the station. The recycled light came on gradually in the corridors. The ventilation hummed its quiet, constant note, and the smell of whatever the kitchen had decided was breakfast drifted through the halls in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. but the quality of the day was different from the others. People moved with a kind of compressed energy that came from knowing something was finally about to end, or finally about to begin, and not being completely certain which one it was. The formal signing of the interstellar peace accords was scheduled for late morning. Every delegation would be present. Every signature, mark, or biometric confirmation that each species used in place of a signature would be recorded, verified, and logged into the conclave's permanent archive. It had taken 11 days, 4 near failures, 1 sabotage attempt, and roughly 3,000 individual conversations to get here. Ambassador Caroline Hale had been awake since before the lights came on. She was at her desk when Ethan arrived for his morning post, and she looked up and said good morning, in the tone of someone who had decided to feel good about the day, regardless of what it planned to do. She asked Ethan how he was. He said fine. She said, she's leaving on the afternoon shuttle. He said he knew. She looked at him for a moment in the direct way she had, no performance in it, just one person checking what state another person was actually in. Then she said, whatever you decide, you've done good work here. That's already true regardless of anything else. Ethan nodded, and went to his post, and stood the way he always stood, present and still and watching. Across the station, in the Velshara quarters, Sarava was completing her own morning in a way that looked on the surface exactly like every other morning of her adult life. She dressed carefully. She reviewed the day's agenda with Kale. She accepted a briefing on the communications that had arrived overnight from the Velshara throne, which included a message from her eldest brother that she read once, put down, and did not comment on. Kale, who had served her for 11 years and had learned to read the spaces between what she said and what she did not say, simply waited. She told him the shuttle departure was confirmed for the 14th hour. He said yes. She said, he has not given his answer. Kale said, carefully, no. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that is also an answer, I think. Kale had no response to this that seemed adequate, so he said nothing, which was the right choice. The signing ceremony was dignified and for the most part without incident. Each delegation came forward in a pre-agreed order, confirmed their participation, and completed their portion of the record. The Grethkai lead, not the saboteurs who had been removed, but the senior diplomat himself, a very old and very formal being who had been deeply mortified by the actions of his staff, made a longer statement than had been planned, acknowledging the disruption and formally affirming his civilization's commitment to the Accords. It was a statement that went about 2 minutes longer than anyone had expected, but no one interrupted it, because the weight behind it was genuine. When it was done, the hall was quiet for a moment, in the particular way of a room that has just finished something important and is not quite ready to move yet. Then the conversation started up again, and people began moving toward the exits, and the conclave of Varath began the slow work of returning to a station instead of a summit. Sarava moved through the crowd with her advisors, exchanging the necessary final pleasantries with 3 other delegations. She did it correctly and completely, because she always did. But she was aware, in a way that she could not fully press down into the professional part of herself, of where Ethan was standing relative to where she was. He was near the back of the hall, the same as always. She finished her last obligation and walked to the corridor. Her shuttle was in the lower bay. Her advisors followed at a respectful distance, because they had all been briefed in the way that staffs are briefed on things without being directly told, that the afternoon might require some flexibility. She had almost reached the corridor junction that would take her toward the lower bay, when she heard footsteps behind her, not hurried, but deliberate, the kind of step that has decided something. She stopped. Ethan stopped a few feet behind her. She turned. He stood the way he always stood, unhurried and clear-eyed, and she thought, not for the first time, that whatever his civilization had built into him, it had built it in very deeply. He said, I thought about what you said. At the window. She waited. He said, I'm not interested in being a symbol. I'm not interested in being a cultural exchange or a footnote in a treaty, or the human who said yes because a princess asked him to. He said it simply and without any edge to it, as a statement of fact about himself, rather than a criticism of her. I've been thinking about this for days, and those parts I'm not interested in. Sarava said nothing. Her expression held. But the version of you that asks real questions, that stands at a window and tells the truth about things that cost you something to say, that wanted to form her own opinion instead of reading someone else's report. He paused. I'd like to know more of that. The corridor was quiet around them. Kale and the other advisors had found pressing reasons to be looking in other directions. Sarava was still for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then she said, I cannot promise that the other parts will be easy to separate from the parts you prefer. He said, I didn't say easy. I said I was interested. Something moved through her face that was not quite a smile, and not quite relief, but was made up of both of them. It was the expression of a person who has been carrying something carefully for a long time, and has just been told they can set it down. Briefly, imperfectly, but for now. She said, then I accept the terms. He said, we can work out the rest. The distance between them was still several feet. Neither of them closed it. They were both people who understood that some things moved better when they were not rushed, and that the beginning of something real did not need a dramatic gesture to make it true. Kale turned back to the corridor after what he judged to be a sufficient interval. He looked at Sarava, who gave him a very small nod. He looked at Ethan, who was already watching him with that steady attention, and Kale, who had served royalty for 23 years and considered himself largely unflappable, felt briefly uncertain about whether he was the one being evaluated. He composed himself and sent a brief message to the Velshara throne on his personal communication device. The throne had been sending increasingly formal inquiries about the status of the declaration for 3 days. The message he sent was short. It said, the human said yes, more or less. Further details to follow. He put the device away and moved to organize the departure. Behind him, Sarava and Ethan walked toward the lower bay. Not together exactly, but not separately either. There were still miles of complicated distance between their worlds. There were political questions that would take months to untangle, cultural differences that neither of them fully understood yet, and a great many people on both sides who were going to have strong opinions. None of it was resolved. But the accords had been signed, the sabotage had been stopped. 11 days of careful work had produced something that might, if people kept showing up and kept choosing to, become something durable. And somewhere in the lower bay, as the shuttle prepared to depart, Danny Ruiz found Ethan and said, in the tone of a man who had been holding a reaction inside for 3 days and could not contain it a single moment longer, I cannot believe you made a princess ask twice. Ethan said, she only asked once. I just didn't answer right away. Danny stared at him. Then he turned around and walked back down the corridor, shaking his head, laughing at nothing in particular. Ethan watched him go. Then he turned toward the bay window, where through the thick station glass the 2 suns were visible, orange and pale yellow-white, turning slowly in the dark the way they had been turning for billions of years before any of them arrived, and would keep turning long after all of them were gone. He stood there for a moment, quiet, thinking, the way he always did. Then he went to say goodbye and to mean it, and to begin figuring out what came next.